There Will Be Blood is one of those films that sticks with you long after you watch it. It's not a fun movie. It's not one you're likely to pop in on a Friday night when you want a good time, but it's one that sucks you in and doesn't let you go when the credits roll. It leaves you feeling uncomfortable, disturbed, and perhaps a little shocked by the ending, but if you're anything like me, it leaves you thinking for weeks, even months afterwards, going back again and again in a dark fascination with its deeply complex characters. This video is not an in-depth review or breakdown. Countless video essays have picked apart every minute detail and nuance of the story and performances here far more competently than I ever could. My goal in this video is just to share what I found most profound as I pondered why it stuck with me. I'm going to be looking at this movie's themes as I interpret them from the perspective of a man of faith. That said, I readily acknowledge that this movie's themes can be interpreted many ways from many different perspectives, and I don't know if this was what the filmmaker necessarily intended me to take from it, so you may get something totally different out of it. However, though I will be describing these themes as I think of them using religious terminology, I hope you can appreciate the same principles I drew from it, regardless of whether or not you share my religious beliefs. So, as you know, I'm just thinking out loud here. And if you like my brain vomit, you know where the like and subscribe buttons are. I will say before I get into this discussion that I will be assuming you've already seen the film, and you really should. So, if you haven't, I highly recommend you check it out. I've left a link to it free with ads here on YouTube in the description. So, without further ado, let's dive into it. Obviously, the standout of this film, the most thoroughly examined aspect of it, and probably the only reason you've heard of it, is Daniel Day-Lewis's role as Daniel Plainview. However, I think equally fascinating and far too overshadowed is Paul Dano's depiction of the greasy and immensely hateable pastor Eli Sunday. Sir Lewis's performance is indeed incredible, but without Dano's for him to play against, I don't think this film would be half so interesting as it is. And I think I only spent as much time thinking about the film's protagonist as I did, because I was spending so much time thinking about its antagonist and his relationship with the protagonist. Yes, this is a movie about one man's greed and ambition and how it ultimately destroyed him, but that story is as fascinating as it is, because it parallels another man's story that may look quite different on the surface, but is actually quite similar. When I watch this movie, I see a story of two very different men who lead very different lives, with very different beliefs and worldviews. So different, in fact, that simply by being in close proximity, they can't help but instantly come into conflict with one another, and they could hardly hate each other more. And yet, I see them both completely gripped by vice and brought down to the same spiritual level, even while their worldly circumstances may look very different, and they each, in a way, bring about the other's destruction, which I'll come back to later. It's relatively easy to see how Daniel fell. I won't spend long talking about it, not because it's not worth talking about, but because it's not primarily what I'm here to talk about. But I want to examine each character to see how Satan got to each and brought them both to the same level. In short, Daniel is a worldly man, an atheist, though he claims otherwise as part of his facade. He is a self-made man who credits no one or nothing but himself with his success. He ultimately rejects both faith and family in relentless pursuit of his insatiable avarice, though he feigns familial love and godly penitence as it serves his ends. Not to say he is entirely heartless, he seems deep down to crave the love of families. He cares for his adopted son, and opens up to who he believes to be his brother, but that man's betrayal hardens him against such empathy, only further embittering him against humanity, and he practically abandons his son when he becomes more a burden than an asset. And if he really did have any good feelings toward religion early on, they were totally smothered by his hatred for Eli. So we can clearly see how Daniel was torn down by the sins of pride and greed, but more fundamentally, by his outright and open rejection of God, both directly through his clear atheism and indirectly through his rejection of all virtues and values in his life, other than selfish ambition. He not only abandoned his child, he abandoned love and compassion entirely. He abandoned his humanity, all but his most carnal, materialistic, self-serving, and self-absorbed feelings and desires, becoming cold, hard, hateful, and miserable. By the end, you can practically see him willfully handing his soul over to Satan. He ends the movie surrounded by wealth, but totally empty, completely devoid of any form or semblance of joy, with seemingly no regret or desire for anything more. And in his heartbreaking final words to H.W., perhaps the one person he ever did really love, he outright denies any and all humanity he ever possessed. To the religious, this form of sin is rather obvious and easy to condemn, but it's not the devil's only way to lead a man to destruction. He has far more subtle and far more sinister ways to tear men down. And this is where we come to Eli. I found Eli so fascinating because whereas Daniel knows who he is and what's in his heart, and he makes no honest claims to virtue, Eli genuinely sees himself as the pure, incorruptible instrument of God, all while being one of the most contemptible villains I've ever seen in a film. Rarely have I felt so happy to watch any character scream like a little girl while getting slapped silly and dragged through the mud. This is the kind of character that, like Dolores Umbridge, you love to loathe with every fiber of your being, because even as they present themselves as humble and virtuous, and genuinely see themselves as such, they are in fact among the most petty, pathetic, conniving, and spiteful individuals on the planet, justifying their despicable actions under their guise of righteousness. Eli is so clearly not a good person, yet he so clearly thinks that he is. I love the scene where, furious with Daniel for daring to humiliate him, he physically assaults his father, the only person physically weak enough for Eli to do to him what he wishes he could do to Daniel, and likely the only person for whom he doesn't care about ruining his reputation. And after calling him an idiot, he asks, "Do you think God saves idiots?" So, in his anger, he seems to think that his father is unworthy of divine grace for the grievous sin of making a business deal with a guy whose own biggest sin, as far as Eli's concerned at this point, is not recognizing and treating him as the prophet he thinks he is. And yet it never at any point crosses Eli's mind that he himself is committing any serious sin by physically assaulting his own father in anger, even while he's speaking of divine judgment. That is the epitome of self-righteousness. Throughout the film, Daniel, both subtly and directly, mocks Eli's dramatic form of preaching as mere acting and showmanship, but I honestly think he buys into his own act as much as his congregation. He's not just a religious con man using his charisma to get rich and popular. He legitimately thinks he's doing God's work, that he's casting demons from people and calling down the Holy Spirit, even as he abuses his position of power for his own satisfaction. When Daniel reluctantly submits himself to Eli's humiliation in order to make a business deal with a member of the church, Eli takes full advantage of the opportunity to get his retribution for the beating Daniel gave him. It's obvious how much he relishes the power his position gives him to humiliate and abuse his enemy, as if by acting in the name of God he is somehow morally superior to him, and thus, whatever he does, justified. That is the thing. To us, he is clearly driven by vanity and spite. But he sees himself as a man of God, called by heaven itself to speak and act on divine authority, and thus, in his eyes, every action he takes and every word from his lips is justified by that divine mandate. He is beyond sin, above it, because how can you sin when you've been chosen by God to be his vessel? He uses the delusion of his divine calling to shift the accountability for his actions from himself to God. He literally thinks he can do no wrong, that everything he says and does is God's will, and thus he is completely blinded to his own true motivations and the true extent of the darkness in his heart. This delusion finally comes crashing down in the final confrontation of these two pathetic, hollow shells of men. It is in this scene that all the facades disappear, Daniel's outward one as well as in Eli's inward. It seems Eli has become just as consumed by greed as Daniel in the years since they last met, though of course he can't see that like Daniel can, and unlike Daniel, his fortunes have turned to the worst. In a moment brilliantly mirroring the scene in the church, Daniel does to Eli exactly what Eli did to him in using his position of power over him to tear down and humiliate his enemy. Eli has gone so far, become so corrupted, that Daniel is able to get him to deny not only his divine calling, but the very existence of the God he claims to serve. And though he certainly looks beaten and broken as he makes this proclamation, it's not until after Daniel reveals he has nothing to give him that Eli seems to realize what he's done. Perhaps he told himself that he was justified in saying what he did because it was what he needed to do to get the money he needed to continue the ministry, to carry on his mission. But once he realized he'd done such an unthinkable act for nothing, that he couldn't have been doing God's will by denying him if it didn't even accomplish anything, then his delusion finally broke, and he beheld with the sorrow, the shame, and the agony of the damned his own awful, sinful state. Having committed the unpardonable sin, the illusion of his righteousness faded away like smoke, leaving only a dark and filthy soul. In this moment, for the first time, he recognizes himself as the disgusting sinner he is, and thus, for the first time, he is actually worthy of pity. He cries and confesses his sin, tormented as if he can already feel the fires of hell. In this moment, he finally seems to see Daniel not as someone beneath him, someone for him to save, but as an equal, for he realizes that he's never been any better than the very man he's despised. I like to wonder whether his penitence might have one day led him to sincere repentance, or whether he would merely have become a miserable wretch, but unfortunately we'll never know, because that's where his story ends, his life meeting its gruesome end, as Daniel's meets its as well, since I'm sure Daniel goes to prison after the credits roll. But I think, even though he was drunk at the time, Daniel did what he did because he knew his life was empty and he didn't care anymore if he lost it all. Like Solomon, he looked on all the works that his hands had wrought, and on the labor that he had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. And so, with nothing left to live for anyway, when the chance came to do the one thing that would bring him any pleasure or satisfaction before his inevitable end, he took it, careless of the consequences. With his final line, "I'm finished," he lets us know he's done the only thing that was left for him to do. A final act of wrath and hatred upon not just this man, but upon the world he's always despised. And now, he's done. His miserable, meaningless life finally over. While Eli, the self-righteous sinner, died in the horrible realization of his fate, disgusted at his own reflection and terrified of the end, desperately running from death, from judgment now embodied in the vengeful spirit of Daniel Plainview, Daniel, on the other hand, met his fate with resignation and even contentment, knowing his lot with the damned and embracing it in willful rejection of grace. I don't know whether he believed in a heaven or hell, or if he simply believed he, like all men, was doomed to die, but whether it was a lake of fire or an empty void that awaited, he figured if nothing else mattered, he might as well go out with a bang. This is a tale of two sinners, brought to the same end by very different means, and meeting it in very different ways. I talked of this in very religious terms, but even if you don't appreciate the religious context, I hope you can appreciate the point that we can end up hated, hateful, miserable, and empty, either by our own choosing and willful rejection of happiness, or without even realizing it, blinded by the self-righteous conviction of our own goodness, not realizing the path we're on until we meet the end. Fortunately, unlike these two miserable characters, if we stop to look at ourselves and look at our lives, we can recognize the path we're on and change it before it's too late. There Will Be Blood is a grim and unpleasant tale, but it can be a cautionary one. Don't be like Daniel. Choose the life of joy, the life of love and faith, over the life of vanity and fruitless ambition. And don't be like Eli. Don't let yourself be so blinded by pride. Have the courage and humility to recognize your fault, take accountability for your actions, and strive to be better. Be the kind of person that people love, and you'll be happier for it. Thank you so much for watching. I'm starting a new series of videos with this one. Most of my videos have taken quite a bit of time to explore an idea or make a point, but like with this video, I'll be using these to just briefly look at specific films or series that stuck with me lately and share any particular thoughts I had about them. These won't be full reviews or deep breakdowns of these movies, nor will they be taking long to explore the ideas I've pulled from them beyond the context of the films themselves. The point of these videos is to be shorter and easier to make, while just sharing a lot of thoughts I've had that just didn't feel worth making a whole video for before. This one was longer than I expected, but most will probably be more concise, as well as less grim and preachy. If you've liked my longer videos, don't worry, I still fully intend to make them. In fact, there's a couple I expect to make pretty soon, so if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the bell. As always, until next time, never stay silent.